Welcome to the third series of Understanding Islam. This is week 5 and we're looking at relieving the sufferings of other people. Every human being has the responsibility, the dignity, to be the khalifa and the abd of God. The khalifa is the regent, the one who acts on earth in the name of God, who puts the will of God into practice. And the abd is the obedient servant. So the human being is required to obey God and to be the agent of God to put that obedience into practice in the world. Now, God has no favorites. The sun shines on all human beings. The rain comes down on the fields of all human beings. So just as God has no favorites, so humankind are one family. And so relieving the sufferings of other human beings doesn't mean that Islam is a mutual welfare society, just looking after suffering Muslims, but rather it is a humanitarian way of life. That is, relieving the burdens of all humankind. This is summed up in the Arabic word Sadaqa, and we can translate Sadaqa as bearing one another's burdens. And so humankind are required to bear the burdens of other people who suffer. As is normal in Islam, Prophet Muhammad acts as a role model for the way in which this Sadaqa should be put into practice. So we see him, for example, going to visit those who are sick, going to visit those who are in any kind of distress or who are grieving or bereaved. We're told that he always went to bed at night with his pockets empty, because whatever had been given to him during the day, he had given it away in charity during the day to relieve the sufferings of others. We're told in the same way one of his sayings when he says that anyone who goes to bed with a full stomach when they know that their neighbour goes to bed hungry is not part of the Muslim community. In effect, one has put oneself outside the community of Islam if one does not take seriously the human responsibility to relieve the sufferings of others. Now, if we ask, how are we to institutionalize this idea of Sadaqa within society? Well, as you can imagine, as within all societies around the world, the relief of suffering has been done by charitable trusts, or in Arabic, a waqf. A waqf, or a charitable trust, is established to enable some work of Sadaqa to take place today, tomorrow, and into the future. So a waqf would be attached to a library or to a place of learning, to a hospital, to a place for the elderly, to a place where people with mental illness or mental instability can go to. But a waqf can also be attached to an orchard, for example, or to a well. Imagine digging a well to provide the water needs of a village. This work would be undertaken by a waqf. Often we find that a waqf has been established by a family. My grandfather set up the waqf attached to that orphanage. My father also, when he retired, put money into that waqf. We sold part of the business. We put some of the money into that waqf. We regard it as our responsibility as a family to make sure that that orphanage never runs short of funds to do its work. This is the spirit of Sadaqa in action then, running right the way through society in the setting up of a waqf. We're told that as we go through life, every human being has two recording angels, and they record the good and the bad deeds that we do. And once we die, the books of our lives are closed shut. There's nothing more that we can do to affect our eternal standing before God, except for three things. We can leave behind us good and pious children who will live an upright life full of taqwa, and they will be a credit to us. We can do something in education, whether it be as a teacher or writing a book, because education cascades down the generations from one generation to the next. Or we can set up a waqf. Because if you think about the contribution that a waqf can make to society, then it goes on from one generation to the next. Imagine that somebody has dug a well to supply the water to a community. Every day that people come to draw water from that well, they'll be blessing the name of the person who paid the money to have it dug. Or if one was to set up almshouses, homes for the elderly poor, every morning you can be sure those people would wake up and bless the name of the person who left the money. And in that way, the good that we do goes on working to our favour even after we have died. The idea of Sadaqa also influences the kind of jobs that we do. So Muslims are required to do jobs that promote good within society, that build society up, and that are not destructive or exploitative of other human beings. So we should not be, for example, making money through things that are forbidden. So the kind of jobs that one does, the kind of business that one sets up, ought to have an ethical dimension. It ought to promote good within society. Just in the same way, what we would today call the caring professions, different branches of medicine, of nursing, of pharmacy, education, teaching, working in a university, being a researcher, all these things that build up the life of society are living examples of Sadaqa in action. If the question is asked, who is my neighbour? Then some Muslim scholars have answered this by saying that neighbours are those people who live in proximity to where you live. Some Muslim scholars have spoken about 40 houses on either side. And so it's very common that whenever there's a family celebration, there's a birth, there's a circumcision or a naming ceremony, there's a wedding, that food will be sent to the neighbours to invite them to join in the celebration. If somebody is sick, food will be cooked and sent so that their family has something to eat too, or people will take care and visit them. How could it be that someone goes to bed with a full stomach when their neighbour goes to bed hungry? Working within the community is also part of Sadaqa. It can be a very small thing, to smile at someone when you meet them, to exchange greetings. And the Islamic etiquette says that the younger person should be responsible for first greeting the older person. And the Quran tells us if somebody greets you with one greeting, then you are to greet them with an even better greeting in response. And so these practical examples of Sadaqa are there. Hospitality has become a hallmark of the Muslim community. Just as Prophet Abraham entertained the angels or the messengers of God unbeknown, so in the same way entertaining guests, entertaining strangers and taking care of them is an important part of Sadaqa. In Islamic tradition, in customary societies, then people who are traveling and who arrive in a strange place are told, seek out the mosque, and there you will be found by the local Muslim community. You will then be invited for food. You might be invited home to sleep, or you'll be able to sleep in the mosque and food will be brought to you. And indeed, there is a tradition that travellers have a right for somewhere to sleep and for hospitality for 3 days before they move on to the next place. So Sadaqa put into practice. Just as the sun and the air, the rain, all come from God, they are freely given to humankind and to the rest of creation, so indeed everything ultimately belongs to God. What we think we own, we are only the custodians or the stewards of the good gifts of God, and they are to be used according to God's direction. We can see this when it comes to trading practices. Our trade should be ruled by the principles of openness, of justice, of equality, of fairness, both to the buyer and to the seller. In the same way, it is an immoral act to hoard the good things of the earth, either to increase the price or to hoard them in a time of shortage when other people do not have enough to eat. There is a story told of 2 men who come to the Prophet Muhammad. One man accuses the other of having stolen food from his storehouse, and the Prophet questions him. He said, "Is that true?" "Yes," he said, "that's quite true, and I'll tell you what happened. In the place where we live, there is hunger. We are all suffering from not enough food. I went to my friend's house, and I said to him, 'Neighbour, please can you share some of your stored food with me? Because my children have nothing to eat, and you have more than you need stored in your storage.' And he refused me. I went back again the next day, and I asked him again, 'My brother, please help me. My children are starving.' And he sent me away again. And so the next night I went back, and I broke into his storehouse, and I took the food. And the Prophet punished the man who hoarded, because he was the one who should have shared the good things of God with the other man and his family who were in need. And indeed, during this time, the time of famine, the punishment for the theft of food was lifted. These were extenuating circumstances. If somebody has more than they need and they're hoarding it, and the other person has nothing to feed their family, then this would be a justification for taking that food in order to feed them. Just in the same way, when we come to the 2 great festivals during the year, at the end of the month of Ramadan, there is the festival of Eid al-Fitr. This festival is celebrated by giving gifts, especially to children, and by having a festive meal, preparing special food. But before any Muslim family can celebrate the Eid themselves, they must take care of their neighbours, those around them, who do not have enough money to celebrate the feast, to provide appropriate food, to provide presents for their children. This is called Zakat al-Fitr, a payment which is given, which is calculated at the cost of 1 meal for each person in the family. And this money is then put together and is discreetly given to some neighbour who is in need. while retaining their dignity, because we are required to bear the burdens of others. In the same way, at the other great festival, the festival of sacrifice, Eid al-Adha, an animal is to be sacrificed, and then the food is to be divided. And it is to be divided into 3 parts. 1 part for the family, 1 part for neighbours, and 1 part for the poor, so that every celebration is on the principle of Sadaqa. But there are lots of parts of the world today in which there's no shortage of food, and this practice would actually lead to an excess of food. And so what quite a lot of Muslims will do in this situation is that they will send to another country the cost to purchase an animal and to have it killed, and then for the whole of the animal to be shared with the poor and hungry people in that place. And this is often referred by the name of qurbani. Qurbani coming from the root of sacrifice. Indeed, this principle of taking care of others around the world can be seen between the rich developed countries and poorer developing countries when it comes to people who have migrated. Because if you have migrated to a country in which you are able to earn a good standard of living, then some of that money will be sent back to the family at home so that they also may be able to live. And indeed, for many societies around the world, these remittances, as we call them, where money is transferred from one member of the family to another part, are an essential part of people being able to live. This humanitarian nature of Sadaqa can be seen as well in various Muslim charities and in the actions of Muslim communities. For example, here in London, we have a recently set up charity called Al-Mizan, which collects money and disperses it in small amounts to people who are in need within society. And in fact, the majority of its money is dispensed to people who are not Muslims, because the humanitarian principle underlies their work. In the same way, some years ago, down in the far southwest of England, a place where very few Muslims live, there was terrible torrential rainfall and there was flooding. And the result of this was that many people were rendered homeless, many water supplies were polluted. And so Islamic Relief, a Muslim charity that's based in the Midlands in another part of the country altogether, their response to this was to load lorries full of bottled water and to go down the motorway to that other place, and then to dispense the water there to those who needed clean water to drink. And in this way you can see that a people who would not normally encounter Islam or Muslims have a living example of what Islam is about when it talks about relieving the sufferings of other human beings. There are many Shia communities in Britain and in other countries too, who take that time of intense mourning during the days of Muharram, the days leading up to Ashura and to the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and his companions. They take the spirit of that season and they set up blood donation clinics. So the message of Karbala, that the true believer must be willing to sacrifice their life, their blood, for the cause of uprightness and truth and against tyranny and injustice, is then transformed in the spirit of Sadaqa, where the blood is shed into the blood donation bottles, and then that blood is placed into the blood donation system to supply blood to anybody who is in need after a major surgery, for example. We all have vivid recollections of the tsunami that struck on the 26th of December 2004, that massive release of water which washed away so many towns and villages and lost the lives of so many people. One of its great epicenters was toward the coastland of Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is the largest Muslim population on earth. And so, not surprisingly, Islamic Relief, which is one of the great international relief and development agencies, went immediately to relieve the suffering of the people of Indonesia. But actually, they went on exactly the same day to Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is a country largely made up of Hindus and Buddhists. And they went on the same day to Sri Lanka, so that nobody could say that this Islamic Relief Agency went to the aid of suffering Muslims one day earlier than they went to the aid of suffering human beings in another part of the world. And there we see this humanitarian principle of Sadaqa. Just in the same way, before the separation of Sudan and South Sudan during the years of civil war, they went to both the northern part of Sudan, which was predominantly Muslim, and to the southern part, which was predominantly Christian. We see lots of occasions of people raising money for projects in different parts of the world, and it may be a Christian organization that's raising the money, and we find Muslim contributions coming to support that work. In the same way, it might be a Muslim foundation which is doing the work, and we see Christian money coming in to support it. There are a number of these joint projects which go on in relief and aid work around the world, sometimes by joint collaboration in the field, sometimes by cross-funding. Sometimes it is that it's a particularly difficult situation for a Christian charity to go to, and so they will then send their money through a Muslim charity with whom they are in partnership, and they deliver on the ground. Or it could be in another part of the world where there are very few Muslims and very little Muslim infrastructure. And so in this case then, the Muslim money is transferred through a Christian organization and the aid is delivered in that place. And so we see humanitarian partnership, the spirit of Sadaqa. Just as the charity Christian Aid wouldn't be Christian if it went only to the suffering Christians of the world, so an Islamic relief organization would not be Islamic if it went only to suffering Muslims around the world. Remember that this is the third series of these Understanding Islam programs, and if you've missed any of the earlier ones, they are all available on the on-demand section of the Ahl al-Bayt website. Remember also that there is an article that goes with every one of these programs that can be downloaded from my own website. Join me again next week when we're going to look at the Islamic principles of care for the earth, ecology, and the environment. I look forward to seeing you then.